So let's get started. A lot of people coming in. My name is Debbie Schwartz, founder of Road to College and the Paying for College 101 group. If you're joining and you realize you're not muted, so please mute yourself as the first thing you do. I'll try and get to you as soon as I can to mute you, but if you come in and see yourself not muted, please do that. And tonight we are talking about admissions testing and the world of test optional and what does that mean? I assume a lot of people on here, and I'd love for you to let us know in the chat, are parents of current juniors. They're probably parents of some sophomores, and you have probably been hearing, about test optional, but you haven't had to deal with it yet. So yeah, somebody put your in the chat, parent of junior, senior, or probably not senior, sophomore, even a freshman, and where you're from. Let me admit a few more people. And so we wanted to have tonight's discussion to tell you more about test optional and to also talk about what test optional has done to the admissions process, good, and maybe some confusing things. And then to talk through, how do you decide if it's important for your student to be taking a test? When should they be taking the test? If they take the test, should they submit the test? So this whole, world of test optional, lots of pros to it. And, but the flip side of it is it has caused, quite honestly, a little bit of confusion because we don't have all the answers. Not that we ever always do, but we don't have all the information that we would love to have to help people make the decision. So we're just trying to give you as much information as possible so that you guys can make good decisions as it relates to your individual students. So tonight, I'm really pleased to be having this conversation and with Katy Langhorst, who is the National Director of Enrollment and Service at StudyPoint. And Katy has a ton of experience in the test prep world. She's been doing this, as she says on here in her own bio, since 2010. And she's brought a lot of interesting data to talk to you about. And, I think it should be a really informative evening. So my only little piece of housekeeping is that, as you can see, this is a meeting and you guys are, so if you want to be on video, I personally love to see people's faces because you do get to see people like over and over again. So it's a little bit of a connection. Keep yourself muted because it interferes with the presentation, but I'm perfectly fine. And Katy's putting up, if you've got questions, put it in the chat. But honestly, if you've got a really pressing question and it might be easier for you to just, ask it, feel free, raise your hand, even unmute yourself and say, excuse me. That's perfectly fine. That's one of the reasons why we do it this way, to just make it easier to get your questions asked and to get your answers. So we will try and look at the questions in the chat. I might interrupt Katy a little bit, like during the presentation. This isn't formal. It's, it's definitely like, she's got a lot of good information, but it's definitely a conversation. And if we don't get to all the questions while she's going through her slides, we'll pick a few after. And, if there's any that are really pressing, or a lot of you've asked a question that we can't get to, I'm sure we'll provide the information in a follow-up email. And lastly, because I always get this question, which is perfectly fine, this is recorded. We will send out the recording probably, around like noon or 1 o'clock tomorrow. So if you have to leave, or maybe you want to watch it again, and people watch these again, you'll have the link sometime tomorrow. So with that, Katy, I would love for you to get started.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Nice to see everybody. As Debbie said, I've been doing this quite a long time, and I also am a parent of a freshman in high school. So I am also a parent on this journey with you, or about to be on this journey with you. So, which is crazy to even think about, that I have a kid in high school, because it feels like he was born 5 minutes ago. So what I would love to talk through with you guys today is a couple of things. First of all, what does test optional mean? There are lots of headlines out there in the media in the last 2 years or so about test optional, test blind, test flexible. A lot of these terms get thrown around. And so I want to start with just some baseline definitions. So we all understand, what do these terms mean? How do colleges use them? And what do they mean specifically for your students? Then we'll take kind of a step back and talk a little bit about how these changes in the last 2.5 years have affected the world of college admissions and how much test scores matter in the process today. And then at the end, I'll get to a little bit more specific advice and kind of a timeline for specifically current sophomores and juniors, because that seems to be what most of you have. And again, happy to take questions about other grade levels as well. So first of all, what's changed and kind of a few definitions. So there are three main terms that you hear sort of thrown about in the world of admissions testing today: test optional, test flexible, and test blind. And they mean three really different things, and it's important to understand the differences. So test blind is the easiest. Test blind is very straightforward. If a particular college or university is test blind, they will not look at your kids' scores. There's not even a place to submit them in their application. They don't want to see them. That's a very, very, very small number of schools. The UC system is the most well-known one, and then there's a tiny handful of others. And those schools, again, literally will not look at a test score. What most schools fall into today, and it started as a result of the pandemic, and we'll talk about how it's shifted, is test optional, which means your student applying to that school can choose whether or not to submit a score. It's not required, but they can choose, do they want to submit it or not. Then there's this third category, which is fairly new, really in the past year or so, which is test flexible, which I think is kind of the most confusing of the three, frankly. Test flexible means there's no requirement for an SAT or an ACT, but if you submit a score, one of those, they'll look at it, or they'll also look at other kinds of scores like an AP exam, state testing, if you're in a state where they have to do things like the New York Regents, that kind of stuff, they'll look at those, any other sorts of standardized testing, IB related exams. So they're saying if you have testing related stuff, send it and we'll look at it, but there's no requirement. So those are kind of the three categories. Test blind, won't look at it. Test optional, you can choose to submit SAT or ACT or not. And test flexible, kind of this mix. And then of course there's test required, which a decent chunk of schools stayed test required through the whole pandemic and are still test required. And we'll talk about that. So in terms of what has happened, those changes have led to a really dramatic shift in application trends. And we'll look at that in a second. The other small piece to be aware of is that the SAT ended the essay section last school year, I believe. So it's no longer part of the SAT at all. If you're taking it on a national test date, some school administered dates still have the essay. So that's one thing to know that's new this year. They also ended subject tests last year. So if any of you have older kids or remember from your own experience, there used to be these SAT subject tests. For a while, they were called SAT 2s, and they were in specific subjects like calculus or English, and they were meant to show mastery of a particular subject. They were shorter, they were 1 hour, they were given mostly in June. Those are gone. They got rid of them last June. So those are two other small changes. In the Q&A, we can talk if anyone has questions about some of the announcements the SAT made last week about the changes that are upcoming. Good news is most of you are parents of juniors and sophomores. That's not going to affect your kids. It's going to affect my kid as a freshman, but it's not going to affect your kids. So I'm not going to get into that too much tonight, although again, happy to answer questions. So as we think about test optional and test blind, a question people often ask is, why have so many colleges gone specifically test optional, but more broadly changed their testing policies? Test optional isn't new. It existed long before the pandemic. There are some schools who have been test optional for 10, 15, 20 years, a handful of schools that have been test blind for years. So it's not a new thing, but it certainly picked up a ton of steam in the spring into the fall of 2020 because the access to testing was so limited. So many high schools were shut, test dates were canceled. So it really wreaked havoc on the world of admissions testing. So a lot of schools, to handle that, went test optional. And if you ask a college why they're doing it, most of them will tell you some version of either we're trying to be compassionate to students and give them flexibility in recognition of the fact that it's been a crazy 2 years now for kids, and access to testing was limited for a period. It isn't anymore. There hasn't been a COVID related test cancellation in several months, but it was limited for that chunk of time. Or they'll say it has to do with really wanting to increase equity and diversity and access to higher education. Both of those are terrific goals. As we walk through how these policies have played out, you'll see that, in my opinion, colleges aren't doing themselves any favors on either of those things. And there've been a lot of kind of unintended consequences of these policies. But that's the big idea, is give students flexibility, show some compassion for what kids have been through, all of our kids have been through, and look for ways to improve equity. What the actual effect has been is basically 3 things have happened. Applications have soared, particularly at competitive colleges, because all of a sudden that barrier of my test score isn't good enough is gone, or at least is diminished. And so students are applying to more schools, and we'll look at that. Applications have jumped at a bunch of schools, which means that their selectivity, the percentage they accept, has plummeted. So schools have gotten more selective in terms of the statistics of it, because all of a sudden they've blown their application pool wide open. And that's had a pretty big effect on the way rankings are calculated. And we'll look at that. And, schools are in many ways a numbers game. And part of how they market themselves is being well ranked on things like US News and World Report. So if you all of a sudden went test optional, tons more kids applied to your school, you all of a sudden look more selective. That's going to look like you've changed the makeup of your institution, which isn't really necessary. You haven't necessarily changed what the incoming class looks like. It's just the statistics have changed quite a bit. We just talked about this, but the role of test scores in US News and World Report is important to understand. So it used to be that if a school had less than 75% of their incoming class that submitted a test score, they were dinged on their rankings by 15%, because US News and World Reports, as they say in this quote, believes, for better or for worse, that these tests are important because they measure a school's ability to attract students who can handle rigorous coursework. They had to shift that because so few schools in the last couple of years had 75% of kids submitting scores. So they've lowered it to 50. And as we look through the statistics, keep that number in mind, because it's playing into colleges' decisions and how they're looking at kids' applications.
Yeah, and I think
that matter a lot.
Right. I think that this kind of got a little glossed over, because we think like everybody here is test optional, and they think that there isn't any pressure for the colleges to necessarily accept students that have tests. But this is kind of like underlying that even though they reduce it from 75% to 50, it's still there, and it still probably plays into the strategies of some of the colleges.
Definitely. Yeah. These rankings matter. Again, we could have an argument about whether they should or not, but they have really an outsized influence on colleges and guidance counselors and that kind of stuff. So it is an important thing. The other thing that happened quite a bit through this world of test optional in the last year to 2 years is there was a real surge in early decision, and we'll look at that. A lot more kids, again, without that barrier of a test score, particularly early in the senior year, because early decision deadlines are, of course, earlier. So those kids who might not have had a great test score in the winter of 2019 might not have applied early. They might have waited for the regular pool. They're applying early now because, again, there isn't that barrier. So that's shifting the makeup of how admissions rolls, and we'll look at that as well. There was also a big shift in the past 2 years towards wait lists, because as you'll see when we look at some of the data, colleges have these very sophisticated enrollment management positions, and the enrollment management positions at colleges are in charge of basically the math. We want to end up with a terrific, well-rounded class of 1,000 freshmen. The question is, how many do you need to admit? How many are going to accept you? How many of those are early decision versus not early decision? They had a really well-oiled machine going at many schools where they knew, okay, if we admit 1,600 kids, we're going to end up with 1,000 freshmen, because they'd done it over and over and over the same way for a bunch of years. 2020 upended all of that, like it upended so many things. And so the math got way more complicated, and colleges, they got to make sure they end up with that 1,000 great freshmen for their class. they had to put more kids on the wait list and kind of use that as a waiting room and a backup plan because they weren't sure how this math was going to play out. So that was another thing that happened quite a bit. This I alluded to, but overall, students applied to about 19% more colleges each this past year than they did in 2019. That's a lot. That's a significant jump across all the gajillions of kids in the country. And again, it's because they didn't have that test score in their way. So they thought, oh, I'll take a shot at a school that might have felt like a reach when test scores were a factor. So students started applying to more schools.
And the parents may not realize, if you're kind of like going through this process for the first time, that kind of the base that started from was already an increase, meaning like over the past few years, students had already kind of widened and increased the number of schools that they were applying to. And then we had this additional jump. Yes,
big jump, definitely. Mm-hmm. So here's, for those of you who like charts and graphs, which I'm a math girl, so I like charts and graphs. So I'm going to run you through some math here. This is just a handful of schools, sort of a somewhat random selection of schools. Look at these jumps in applications. So this is applications in 2020 versus 2021, up a lot. From 20%, 30%, 40% in some cases. So this was the real thing. It was a pretty significant jump in terms of applications. And this is despite the fact that demographically, the number of kids going to college is actually down a little bit because of the way birth rates played out. So it's not as if there are 30% more 17-year-olds out there to apply. They're just applying to more schools, particularly on the competitive side. This slide would look really different depending on the pool of schools that you looked at. So schools that accept 50% or more of the kids that apply, the less competitive set, saw a decrease in some cases in applications. So there was just a real shifting of trends here over the past couple of years. As a result, what's happening is as applications are going up, they're accepting a smaller percentage, right? Because again, they only have the number of seats they have unless they build new dorms. So they have 1,000 spots. If they got 30% more applications, they had to drop their selectivity percentages. So again, this is making schools look way more competitive when nothing changed about the basic dynamics of the school. Getting into Harvard today, you could argue, looks 30% harder because they got so many more applications in the last couple of years. And again, this trend is across lots and lots of schools. We just pulled out a handful to look at. The other thing, and we were talking about early decision earlier, a lot of colleges are filling a much bigger chunk of their class from the early decision pool. And I could talk for an hour about early decision, and again, happy to take questions, but it's a really interesting dynamic because the early decision class is a sure bet. That pool is a much surer bet for colleges, right? There are several kinds of early plans. Some are binding, some are not. But either way, the concept of it is your student is applying only to their first choice school. Again, the level of restrictions vary, but basically the concept is you're applying to your top choice. Therefore, if you get in, you're going to go. So back to those poor enrollment managers sitting there in colleges trying to figure out what to do. They know that kids they accept in this chunk are almost certainly, it's like 95% going to go to their school. So if they can fill a chunk of their class through the early pool, they have those kids kind of locked in, and it makes their math a little easier and takes off some of the pressure in the regular decision pool. And so over time, the chunk of students coming from that early pool has been growing, and it jumped a bunch in the last year. So you can see schools are filling this, again, this handful, 30, 40, 50% of their class in the early decision pool. Again, because they know those kids are going to come. They're sort of a safe bet. So this is a really striking trend.
Katie, can I ask, although this is a great question, chart you're going to go to next, but there's a question here, and it's a little out of order, but I think it's an important question because if parents are like new to the process and we didn't maybe make this clear, but Michael is asking, what are the characteristics of a school that are test optional? Are they more likely to be small, private, liberal arts, top 50? It might have been that way at one point, but now explain who is test optional.
Yeah, so almost 100% of schools went test optional last year, kind of the pandemic year, because they kind of had to. If you required scores, so many kids weren't able to take a test or were able to take only one. So I don't know the exact percentage, but probably pretty close to 100% of schools went test optional the prior year. This past year, a bunch went back to being required. Some stayed test optional. And it's really a wide cross section. There are big state schools that are test required. There are big state schools that are test optional. The Ivy League, for the most part, is test optional this year. I think this year and next year, I believe, is the most recent announcement, and kind of everything in between. It really depends a lot on the philosophy of the school, their position and kind of their selectivity rankings, and how they wanted this to play out. There is also some regional differences. You know, the pandemic affected certain parts of the country more dramatically in terms of access to tests. And we'll talk about this towards the end. We talk about local context, but look, if you were a student in New York in 2020 trying to take an SAT, you pretty much couldn't. It was really, really challenging. If you were a student in Texas, it was quite a lot easier. Most Texas testing centers stayed open, tests were not canceled. So some of the should we be test optional or not is affected by the regional context of the school. Does that answer the question?
Yeah. I wanted to kind of give people a sense that just as you said, there aren't really particular characteristics that make one school, test optional versus another. And I mean, probably the biggest factor maybe for some of the schools is just the state, because particularly if it was a state, the state system, it was, a decision that was, made at the legislative level, not necessarily at the school level. And that is particularly like Florida state never went test optional the whole time. And then I think it was the Georgia state schools were test optional, but then they went back to requiring tests. So
yeah, it's been all over the map, definitely. Yeah. And the other thing that's important as your students are forming lists is to research each college individually. Don't assume that a college is or isn't, or is test flexible or is test blind. Every school is kind of in its own boat at this moment. So the research side of this process is more important than ever as your student starts to form their list. So you understand what you're getting into. Cool. So then how did it play out on the kind of score or no score side? So this shows you the percentage of the admitted class. So of the kids that each of these schools admitted, what percentage of them had a test score. This is a little complicated and a little hard to interpret because obviously if a kid has a bad test score, they're probably not going to submit it. So one effect of test optional policies in the regular test optional schools is you kind of sliced off the bottom chunk of tests that would have been submitted in a test required year. So you can see if you look at taking Vanderbilt as an example, around 60-ish% of the kids who got in submitted a test score. You could interpret that two ways. Either a test score helped them get in, or the kids who were already strong candidates and had strong academic profiles also had good test scores, therefore they sent them. So this doesn't necessarily mean that having a test score gave you a better chance of getting in. This slide at least doesn't, but it does give you some sort of insight into what's starting to develop as a trend in these test optional schools. Again, happy to take questions on that if it's confusing. This I think is really striking. So this is of the kids who submitted a test score at each of these 4 schools, what percentage got in? That's the greenish tealish bar. And then the purple bar is of the kids who did not submit a test score, what percentage got in? So taking a look at Emory, 17% of kids who applied with a test score got in, 9% of kids without a test score got in. So way higher rate with a test score. Again, what's the chicken and what's the egg here, right? It doesn't mean the test score got the kid in, but it means that overall the kids with test scores had a better shot, probably because they also had strong academic profiles. But again, this is pretty striking at a lot of schools. You can see at Vanderbilt, not that different. Some schools, Colgate, it's like double, a little more than double the rate. So how schools are looking at test scores in the overall picture of their admissions decisions can really vary a lot depending on the school. Couple other caveats as you're doing research on specific schools to know about schools that are test optional. There are flavors of test optional, just to make this even more confusing. Some schools are doing a thing where they use an index that's calculated based on your student's GPA, other test scores, and class rank. And they're saying, okay, here's this number. And if you're above a threshold, you don't need to submit an SAT or ACT. If you're below, you do. but you don't really know until you get to the point of application where your kid's going to fall on that threshold. So it's kind of a tricky sort of fine print kind of thing, but some schools have put that condition in place. Other schools are saying, we're truly test optional, submit it or don't. But if you choose not to submit it, we're going to want some extra stuff. Could be samples of work, research papers, additional recommendation letters. And again, this is because admissions officers are struggling in many institutions to figure out how to make decisions between two really strong candidates without test scores. Sometimes they need more information. So again, as your students are forming their list and researching, make sure you read really carefully those admissions pages and understand exactly what they're requiring, what they're not, what sort of the fine print is, because it can get really complicated. Another thing to know is even at schools that are kind of headline wise test optional, excuse me, in some cases, they are requiring scores in certain situations. So many schools are test optional, particularly large schools are test optional overall, but in specific majors, often engineering, STEM majors, nursing, they are requiring a test. So again, a little tricky. I don't feel like colleges are being as transparent as they could because they're saying, hey, we're test optional, but oh, not for the engineering students, that one you need a test. So again, the research side is important. Athletic recruiting in some cases requires tests. Some schools have waived it for this year, some schools haven't. But if you're looking at athletic scholarships, in many cases, tests are still required or preferred by coaches as they work on filling their class for athletic scholarships. Many, though not all, merit scholarships still require tests. The Florida Bright Futures one is one that comes up all the time, but other states have them as well. So even some states where the state system has waived testing overall, it's still required for merit scholarships, which I know is a big favorite topic of Debbie. So that's a real important one. Course placement. So some colleges are using SAT and ACT scores, not as a requirement for admission, but as a way to waive freshman year classes. So they'll say, well, if you have an SAT above X amount for the math section, you can, skip this level of math and go into sophomore level math, or however their levels are set up. So that can be a key thing. So it's not required, but having it can be an advantage as once your student gets to the school looking at placement. I was actually on the phone with a parent yesterday whose kid was admitted early, but they said you're admitted early without a test. But in order to go, either she was trying to get into an education program, in order to be admitted into the education program, we need a test by June 30th. That was the first time I'd heard that they're letting a kid in and then requiring a test. So schools are in some ways grasping at straws, trying to figure out how to navigate their way through all of this. Out of state or international students in some cases are required to have tests. If you're applying from one state to live in one state, applying to a different state university. In most cases, international students, they're still requiring tests. Again, I wish I had a simple rule for you, but it just varies a ton by institution. So doing research is important. The other key thing, and this isn't specifically about testing, but plays into what's happening here, is grade inflation is a real thing. This is old data. This data goes from 1990 through 2009. I wish there was better updated data. There isn't, but at least not on a wide scale collected like this. But the trend of grade inflation across American high schools is very strong and has only continued. I can guarantee you that those lines continue to go up, particularly during the pandemic, where teachers, rightfully so, said, oh my gosh, these kids have been through so much. Let's give out more A's than we might normally do, or go pass fail. My daughter's school went pass fail for most of last year. So the key pillar that college admissions officers often turn to when there isn't a test is GPA. It makes sense. What's the best indicator of a student's ability to handle academic work? How they're handling the academic work they have now. And many have this system of weighting courses based on rigor and difficulty level. If those are going up, if an A today means something different than an A 5 years ago, they're harder and harder to rely on as a distinction point. So they're having, Harvard sitting there with hundreds of kids with straight A averages and 4.0s. So taking away that test score is making it even more challenging to make those decisions because of the trends in grades.
I'll tell you one other thing about GPA too, Katie, like, again, as someone who likes to get as much data as possible, and we look at a lot of common data sets, which is a whole nother topic, for people who may not know what that is. Not all the schools, a lot of schools obviously give you their average GPA, but they won't give you a breakdown of further, like what is the top 10% of their, students GPA and that type of stuff. So you don't get as much granularity actually related to GPA as they used to give, and they do still give with test scores.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing I forgot to mention back on that purple and green slide, where was that one? This one, you might look at that list of schools and say, that's sort of a random selection of 4 schools. It's because this data is actually really hard to get. Colleges don't want to answer this question. And so these 4 schools and a handful of others are the ones that have published it, which I think is great from a transparency perspective. Schools don't want you to see this because, again, their stated mission is equity. It doesn't matter. You submit what you have. We're looking at everybody equally. It's not really how it's playing out in terms of the actual admissions process. So it presents a bit of a conflicting message for colleges, which is why this data is really hard to get your hands on. These 4 schools have been very transparent about it. Some others have too. Many won't tell you. They will not answer that question of what percentage of the kids who submitted versus didn't got accepted to their school.
And to that point, Katie, if you don't mind, there was a question that kind of just said, seems like most of the information we've provided so far is about the competitive schools, and so how does, and to some extent, yes, and, but like, how does some of what we're talking about, Emory and Colgate and Vanderbilt, they're definitely the more selective schools. How does that might translate to some of the schools that might be less selective?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it really depends school by school. Again, I wish I could give you a general guideline because it would make life a heck of a lot easier for parents. It's very school by school. So many of the schools that are on the less selective side who accept 50, 60, 70, 80% of students actually use scores as a bigger part of that process because they just have set cutoffs. If you're a 26 or higher on the ACT, you're in. If you're a 28 or higher, you're in with a X, 50% ride. If you're a 30 or higher, you're in with a full ride. So sometimes the much larger schools that are accepting a much bigger percentage of kids have to use test scores more just because they have so many applications to wade through. So it really varies a ton. And the key is to look at the specific institutions, understand what their policies are as you're going into the process so that your kid has the options that they want to have and aren't limited by not having a test score. I don't know if that answered the question, but again, I wish there was a cleaner answer.
Right.
Yeah, it's all over the place. Where was I? Grade inflation. Okay, so one question that parents ask us all the time is, should my student take the test? And, I work for a company that does test prep tutoring. So certainly this is what I live and breathe every day. But in my opinion, and I think it's very well supported by data, there's no reason not to try it. And the only situation in which I can think of where your student should not try a test at all, and we'll talk about what that means, would be if there's a really significant amount of anxiety around the test, which does sometimes happen. Other than that, and you feel like the effect on your students' mental health or stress level is going to be pretty significant. That certainly exists and happens. With the exception of that limited situation, my belief, and the data supports, every student should try it. And there are lots of ways to try it to figure out where you're starting. What is your starting point? We offer free practice tests. There are practice tests you can download on the internet. You can take a real test, sign up and go and take it and not send it to colleges. So your student is in control of what scores a college sees. So if they take it and it's terrible, they cannot send it. It's still a good practice kind of dry run. So this is really important feedback because it's going to give you a sense of where your student stands. It's also extra practice at standardized testing in general. Even if they don't end up using it, going through life, there are a lot of checkpoints in life where you have to take tests, whether that's graduate school, licensing exams, bar exams, you name it. There's lots of standardized tests in our lives, completely aside from college admissions. So giving your student a trial run through it is good practice for that and can be good feedback as well. So my advice is every kid should take it at least once, even if that's a practice test, just to see where you are and to get that information so that you can make informed decisions. Then the question is, should you do test prep? Again, I work for a test prep company, so you might expect me to say, yes, everyone should do test prep. I don't think that's necessarily true. It really depends on a couple of factors. One is, once you have that baseline, how far are you from where you are to where you want to be? So if you're looking at a school and the school says that their middle percentile ranges of accepted students is like a 34 and your student's at a 20, it might not be worth it. That's a pretty big jump. And I put here our average score increases, not to brag, but just so you have a sense of scale. Many test prep companies don't publish their score increases, but a kid who does a decent amount of work, starting from a reasonable score, can expect 2 to 5 points of increase on the ACT through test prep. There's more, there's less, but that's kind of a general range. So if you're 10 points away, unless you really think your kid bombed it and had a bad day, which happens, or didn't try or misgraded, trying to jump up 10 points to a target, it's going to be challenging. Think in that 2 to 5, 6 ACT points. On the SAT, again, there's a range, but our average 179, but I've seen kids increase more like 100 up to 200, 250, 300. So if you're dramatically far from where you want to be, test prep might not get you where you want to go. And I think it's important to be realistic about that. Again, we've seen huge jumps, but this is kind of where most kids generally fall. The other thing that's important to think about is, where are you in the timeline and the calendar, and what else is on your kid's plate? We are all busy parents with busy kids with busy lives who have lots of activities. And test prep is a commitment like anything else. I say to parents every day, your kid will get out of it what they put into it. If they're not positioned to put enough into it, it's not worth your time and your money. They're not going to see the results. I wish I had a miracle cure, but there isn't one. It's all about what they put into it. So trying to balance, how far are you from the target test date? And we'll talk timelines in a minute. What are your options? If it's October of your senior year and those deadlines are December of your senior year, it might not be worth it. You might be better off spending your time working on essays or recommendations or your GPA or academic subjects. So understanding the time piece is important, because there is no quick fix when it comes to improving scores like any skill. We'll look at a chart about this in a second, but the other thing that's important is how far we think about kind of the discrepancy between your GPA and your test score. So if you have a kid who's a straight A student who really excels and the test score isn't so great, there's probably a lot of potential to improve it, because chances are that test score, they're not performing up to their potential because they need work on strategies and practice. So understanding how big that discrepancy is going to help you understand how much you're likely to get out of test prep. If your kid's generally a C student and their test score is kind of in the middle, probably you're not going to get them to a 99th percentile score, right? Test prep is not a miracle cure. So trying to understand that gap is really important. How big a factor is merit aid? Again, Debbie's favorite topic. There are a lot of really, really, really great merit aid options out there that are tied to test scores. If that's a factor for your family financially, and you think it's something that your kid might be in line for, test prep can pay off in an incredible way. If that's not as big a factor in your world for whatever reason, might not be as worth it. The other thing to think about is, how long is your college list? If you have a kid who's really set on a school or a couple of schools, and they are in that competitive set of schools, having a good score is going to matter more. If you have a kid who's got a wide range of options, not having a good score and choosing not to submit it might be okay, because you're probably going to get into one of the choices on the list. So understanding your kid's particular situation and list is going to matter a lot. This is a very general chart, and I don't want anyone to get too hooked on these numbers because they can vary a lot. But this is a chart that's published that shows, based on a GPA, what sort of your predicted SAT or ACT. Again, don't get too set on these numbers. I've seen kids perform way above and way below these levels, but this is where it comes to kind of the discrepancy. Again, if you're at a 4.0 GPA and your ACT is at 21, it's a pretty big gap. So there's probably a lot of potential to improve there. Then the question is, once you have a score, whether it's you took it and your student did well, you prepped and improved and did well, once you've got what you think is the best score you're going to have, then the question becomes, do I send it or not? So a couple of factors to think of. You should submit it if you're happy with the score. If the student feels good about that score and feels proud of it and feels like it enhances your overall profile, in most cases, you should submit it. Again, there are exceptions, but generally that's going to help enhance your application. Back to Debbie's question, is the college competitive? Do they have less than a 50% admit rate? You might need to score more in those places. Again, totally depends on the specific school. How big a deal is merit money? Again, if you have a good score and you can submit it, it's going to help you with merit money. That can be really important. Are your scores or your score at or above the college's average? Colleges publish this data. Debbie has some great sources of data. There are lots of websites out there you can find to see what's kind of the typical range for admitted students at a particular school. If your kid's score is in that range, submit it. If it's way below that range, you might not want to. It might detract from your profile overall. One thing to know about those ranges, back to the graphs we were looking at a few minutes ago, if you assume that, in 2019, everybody was submitting a score because it was required, and today in 2022, a chunk of people are not, that means you've lost that bottom piece of the scores, the kids who are choosing not to submit it, which means the average is scooched up a bit. So understanding how to interpret those score ranges can be really hard. They can look really intimidating at the moment, especially at some of the top tier schools. So thinking about how does your kid's score fit with those ranges? Does your score enhance your academic profile? Does it complement your grades? Does it add to a story of who your student is as a student? If so, submit it. And then specific majors, as I mentioned, if you're applying to STEM or engineering, nursing, specific majors where either it's required or it's preferred, you're going to want to submit that score.
So I'm sorry, Katie, can you scroll back? Because there were two questions. Actually, they're the same on yes, this one. Oh, the GPA. Just people wanted to clarify if the GPA you were showing was weighted or unweighted.
Good question. It's hard to say because colleges take GPAs and they reweight them in lots of different ways. So these are just general ranges. So I think these would probably be unweighted, but again, it can vary a ton. And know that if your high school says, okay, my kid's weighted GPA is 4.5, colleges don't always calculate it that way. What most colleges do is they take the transcript, they have a whole system for saying, okay, this is an AP course, this is an honors level course, here are all the grades. They do sort of their own magic math and come out with their own number so that they can compare across high schools across the country and different grading systems.
Yeah, and actually people were asking that question. I was giving that similar answer and really encouraging people, you have to just ask the college how they do their calculation.
What do they use? Exactly. It's complicated. Yep. Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but can you please explain what weighted GPA is versus unweighted GPA?
Yes, great question. So weighted GPA has to do with not just taking, your kid has 3 A's and a B, and therefore they calculate the math. A weighted GPA means the rigor of the courses is taken into account. So for example, if it's an A in an AP level calculus course, for example, it basically is given more weight, that's why it's called weighted, than an A in a general, junior year math course. So it accounts for the fact that getting an A in an honors level or an AP level is harder theoretically than getting an A in kind of a general ed sort of level. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. When shouldn't you submit it? Kind of the opposite of the prior slide. If the score is really low and it's going to detract from your profile, don't submit it. Again, that's the beauty of test optional, is if your student is otherwise very, very strong and the test score is a real Achilles heel for him or her, don't submit it. Again, leaving it off is a perfectly fine option in those situations. One key there is the local context really matters. And this was particularly true in the height of the pandemic year, which was, as I said, if you were in Texas, applying from Texas, for example, to a school, schools know that you had lots of chances to take the SAT and ACT because Texas didn't shut down tests nearly the way other places did. If you were in Boston trying to take a test in that year, you probably couldn't, no matter how hard you tried or wanted to. So now if you're an admissions officer looking at kids from 2 different places, you're going to have that local context in mind. That's still true even now that we are, well, I hate to say we are post-pandemic because I suppose we are not quite yet, but now that tests are widely available, let's put it that way, tests are back to being widely available. Admissions officers know a lot about high schools. They have huge databases and researchers who understand the context of a local high school. So if your kid goes to a high school where pretty much everybody takes the SAT or ACT and your kid doesn't submit a score, they're going to assume it wasn't good, right? Whereas on the other hand, if your kid goes to a high school where some kids take the SAT and ACT, some kids don't, there's a wider range, it's probably not going to be looked at in the same way. Also, there are many states where SAT or ACT are required for graduation. And in some of those states, the SAT or ACT score is printed right on their transcript. So in that case, the school might be test optional, but they're going to see that score there as well. And colleges are going to know if you're applying from Illinois, they're going to know you took the test because you had to. So choosing not to submit it, in some cases, the college is going to say, wait a minute, I know this kid took it. They're going to sort of assume that the test score must not have been a good complement to your application. So everything that a college does is going to be interpreted in kind of a holistic way in the context of your student's particular high school and kind of local situation. Sense? Okay, timelines. These are really general and really high level, and kids can vary a ton in terms of where they are and what they need. But I thought I'd pull together just some basic timelines for what a current junior today in February of junior year should be thinking about. And then the next one is current sophomores. Again, really high level, can vary a ton depending on the student. Overall, for current junior, in most cases, your students will have taken the PSAT in October, this past October. Not all, it used to be almost every kid took it. Some high schools are offering it, some high schools don't, but the vast majority of kids took a PSAT in October of their junior year, which is great because you have a baseline. And our general recommendation is take a practice SAT or ACT in the winter, do some test prep, plan for 2 to 5 months. Again, can vary a lot depending on how far you have to go, timing, schedule, but assume you're going to do some prep through kind of the winter into the spring, and then take an April, May, or June SAT or ACT. And there's April and June ACT, May and June SAT. So generally that's a good timeline. Start in the winter, prep through the kind of early spring, take a test. Our goal in our company is take that and you're done. You know, we are not believers in take it a gajillion times. If you've done a good solid amount of test prep and put in the work, you take that late spring test, hopefully you're at your target score, and great, you move on to essays, college tours, interviews, all that other stuff. If you need it, there are additional test dates. There are a July ACT and an August SAT, and then a handful in September and October of the senior year. So those are there, and there's nothing wrong with taking tests then. It just makes the senior fall really crowded with lots of stuff. There's lots of other things in this process that are happening in the senior fall. So if you're the parent of a junior right now in February, your goal typically should be, let's get all this over with by ideally before the summer or during the summer, so that that senior fall, the testing isn't still going on and the test prep isn't still hanging over your student's head. Again, that's a very general recommendation. Part of what we do, what my staff does every day, is work with parents to counsel you on your specific situation. But at a high level, that's kind of a typical junior timeline. If you're the parent of a sophomore, you're a little ahead of the game and you have some extra time. So here's how I might recommend spreading it out a little bit, which is in the winter of sophomore year, take an SAT or ACT, see how your kid's going to do, get that baseline. They're going to get better over time as they have more content under their belt, but a baseline is going to give you a good decision-making point to understand where your kid stands. One key factor for sophomores, sometimes for juniors, but very much so for sophomores, is you really want to start test prep when you're either done or almost done with Algebra 2. That's the key math course. The SAT and ACT cover almost no math beyond Algebra 2. So if your kid's advanced and is in pre-calculus in sophomore year or calculus or anything beyond that, to some degree, you don't want to wait too long, because what starts to happen is they get rusty and they forget this Algebra 2 that they might have taken in 7th or 8th grade. Calculus is way harder, doesn't necessarily build on some of those Algebra 2 skills. So we often see kids who took Algebra 2 as sophomores, they get into junior year, by late in the junior year, their math skills are weaker. Their math skills for the tests are weaker because they're just rusty. So our advice is, if your student is taking Algebra 2 as a sophomore, the spring of sophomore year, between sophomore and junior year, is a great time to prep. The longer you wait, the further they get from that math content. But the opposite is true. If your student hasn't taken Algebra 2, is not in it as a sophomore, you don't want to prep during sophomore year. It's too early, because trying to teach that content that they haven't seen yet is not the best use of your time or money. So you really want to wait until they are done or mostly done with Algebra 2 before you start to prep. Then again, there are summer SATs and ACTs. They'll take the PSAT typically in October of junior year. If you're taking Algebra 2 as a junior, you would do your test prep more during the junior year to try to kind of get it done. But there's no disadvantage to doing it early as long as you have that math content.
So Katie, there's this question about ACT versus SAT. First, do colleges look at them differently or the same? And then how do you determine which, should your student be taking the SAT or taking the ACT? How do you help make that?
And this is another topic I could talk about for an hour, but I'll give you the 2 key things you need to know. Well, 3 key things. 1, all colleges accept both equally and have no preference. People will tell you there are rumors that that's not true. It is 100% true, I promise you. Every single college in the US accepts both equally and has no preference. What they want, and they will tell you this, is they want you to submit the one that highlights your strengths the best. 2 key differences, and again, I can go into more detail, but 2 key differences between the tests. One is the amount of math and kind of the weighting of the math. So the SAT has 2 sections, half math, half reading. So 50% math, 50% reading. The ACT has 4 sections, math, 2 reading-based sections, English and reading, and then a science section, which is really sneaky, if you ask me, because people think a science section is going to be about science. It's actually not really about science, and it has almost no math in it. It's really a reading comprehension section and kind of a critical reading strategy section with a science theme. So if your student is a good reader, you don't have to come into that test with any science background knowledge at all. It's really a critical reading focus section. So on the ACT, you have math as 1, and then the other 3 quarters are reading-ish, reading-based. So if you have a kid who's a strong math student, the SAT is generally a better choice because you can highlight that strength. It's half your score. It's going to help you. And the opposite is true. So the kid who's more of an English reading, language arts sort of kid, having the ACT be 3/4 that, you can kind of hide that math score a little bit because it's only 1/4 of your score. So that's one key thing. Kid who leans more towards math, generally SAT is better. Kid who leans more towards English, reading, language arts, generally ACT is better. The second key factor is timing. So the ACT is a little bit of a faster paced test. You have more questions per minute or less seconds per question. Not dramatically faster. Both are time tests. Both certainly have time pressure in them. It's not as if the ACT is a cakewalk. Sorry, the SAT is a cakewalk on timing, but the ACT is quicker. It's more of a kind of bang, 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 move on, don't get stuck on something kind of test. The SAT gives you a little more time per question, and they're a little bit more kind of stop, think it through, process it for a minute sort of questions. So you know your own kid. If your kid is a keep moving, get it done, move right ahead, isn't stressed out by time pressure and can kind of keep flowing, often ACT is a way to highlight that strength. If you have a kid who runs out of time often on things or can get stressed out by having to move quickly and is a little more of a deliberate thinker, likes to sort of puzzle through things, often SAT is better. So those are the 2 key things, math and timing.
No, I'm just, there's somebody just by the name of PG, who is raising their hand. I'm giving you the option. If you want to unmute and ask your question, please do. So we'll give you a few seconds. Oh, did you? Okay. So if you want to at any point unmute, like let us know, or just put the question in the chat. But there's a few other questions kind of related to what you were asking or talking about. And here's a good question about, is there a downside to taking the SAT or obviously the ACT multiple times?
Yeah, good question. We generally recommend no more than 3 times. If your kid is, PSAT aside, if your kid has taken 3 SATs or 3 ACTs, unless something happened, unless you walked into that 3rd test and, you know, they weren't feeling well or had a really rough day or something else happened and they just bombed it for reasons that have nothing to do with the test or skills. In general, by the 3rd time, you're probably as high as you're going to get. We see a good amount of score increase between 1st test and 2nd test, some score increase between 2nd and 3rd, assuming you did some work in between. Generally, you kind of hit a plateau. Colleges don't limit the number of times you can take it. You technically could take it 5, 6, 7 times, I suppose. Again, often it's just not worth your time or money after the 3rd try. Again, with that asterisk of sometimes crazy things happen on a particular day, and it's nothing to do with the test. It just things go wrong.
So along the same line, if your student ends up taking the test multiple times, maybe just touch a little bit on super scoring, and then what can you send in to the college? Like, do they see all these multiple times that a student might take a test?
Good question. So super scoring is a policy that many colleges have. I don't know what percentage, but a decent number super scores. So what that means is, let's say your student took it 3 times. Let's use SAT because the math is easier. Let's say your student took it 3 times and they got, the first time they took it, they got a, I don't know, 500 math, 500 reading. Second time, they had a really great day on math and got a 700 math, 500 reading. Again, just to keep the adding simple. Then they took it a 3rd time and the scores flipped, which happens. The math was a 500 and the reading was a 700. So your totals were 1,000, 1,200, 1,200. So your best score on a particular day is 1,200. What some schools will do is they will take your highest individual section that you've taken ever, even across multiple days, and add them together. So in that scenario, if the 2nd testing date had the highest math of 700, the 3rd testing date had the highest reading of 700, they'll put those 2 together and give you a 1,400 as a total. Again, not all schools do it. It's another one of those things that you have to research on the school's website. But that can be a nice advantage because it allows you to sort of pick your best parts over multiple test dates. What was the other question? Oh, they see all the scores? That varies school to school. So some schools tell you that they want you to submit all of your scores and they want to see them all. Some schools say submit your best total. So in the example I just gave, that would be your 1,200, either 1,200, I guess. Submit your best total. Other schools say submit your best sections and they'll super score it for you. So another thing that varies college to college, important to look at the policies on their website.
Okay, there's somebody else raised their hand. Lisa Latorino, not saying it correctly.
No, it's okay.
Go ahead.
I just have a quick question. My daughter took her first ACT in December.
Okay.
And I didn't realize this, but when I signed up, I was like, oh, they asked for your colleges that you want the scores to send to because it was free. It didn't cost anything. So I put a couple of schools. Was that a bad thing to do?
Yes. Right.
Yeah, sorry.
Uh-oh.
I don't want to give you guilt, but
right. It wasn't a terrible thing to do because you didn't know, and hopefully the scores were decent. But yes, once you have sent them, they see them. So generally we say if you're taking it for the first time, particularly for taking it cold as kind of a practice dry run, don't send it to anybody. You can always later send it to whoever you want. There is a fee. I can't remember. I think it's like $15 or something like that to send it later. But until you know what the score is, our advice to parents is you want to maintain control of where those scores go. And so wait till you see it and then decide.
Okay, so there's no way to reverse that once it's done.
Not that I know of. No, I wish. It happens a lot to lots of parents and lots of kids. But yeah, no, once they're there, they're there.
Hopefully a second one she does. I mean, she didn't do terrible, but hopefully she does better.
And a lot of colleges, excuse me, a lot of colleges tell you that they also want to see improvement. So if you've taken it 3 times and the first time you got 1,000, the second time you got 1,100, third time you got 1,200. Again, colleges look at all of this as a holistic picture. So showing progress over time, particularly if the first score was pretty early in your high school career, is not a bad thing, right? They're not going to only look at that one first score and ignore the rest. They're going to look at it as part of a whole picture.
What is a good ACT score for not Ivy League, like just for a good school, a medium-sized good school like University of New Haven or Scranton?
Yeah. It's a great question. I wish there was an easy answer. Totally depends on the school. They are all over the map. And I think the key is to do your research and look at what the school's score range is. I think national average, and somebody could check this for me, make sure this is true. I think the national average for ACT is 21. I can't remember what it is for SAT, 1,000, 1,100. I can look it up and send it to you. That's national average across everyone. One other trend in testing that's been happening, I mentioned earlier that some states require kids to take the SAT or ACT. Either as a graduation requirement or just during the school day. That's fairly new. That's been a growing trend in the last maybe 10 years or so, but that's dramatically increased the number of kids that take the test because lots of kids are now taking the test who might not have before. So that's shifted the overall national averages a bit because you've just widened the pool of kids who are taking it. So it really can depend on the school. And everything is all about the context of the colleges on your list.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Of course. I get that question all the time. I wish there was an easy answer like, oh, 25, you're good. But it so depends on what you're looking for.
And here's a really good question. And we didn't go into depth on the PSAT, but somebody is asking, well, A, should you prep for the PSAT? And if you did SAT prep, would that help for the PSAT?
2 very good questions. Should you prep for the PSAT? Generally, no. People will sell you prep programs on it. Our general rule is, but the PSAT is truly practice. It does not go to colleges. It is used as a feedback point for you, your student, and your guidance counselor. The only thing it's kind of used for in the real world is national merit scholarships. National merit scholarships are really very extremely hard to get. I think a lot of parents hear that and think, oh, my kid's a good student. This is a great opportunity to get money. They're really, really, really hard to get. It's a very tiny percentage of PSAT scores that get them. And it's not a very large dollar amount. I'd have to look up, you might know, Debbie, what it is now, but
it's like $2,000.
Yeah, I was going to say 1,700. I think it was 1,700 a few years ago. It's not a lot of money. Again, every dollar counts, but it's generally not as much money as people sort of think it's going to be. So I feel like in many ways, national merit has taken on a bigger sort of profile than it deserves. If you have a kid who's very close to national merit and the levels vary by state, the cutoff scores, if you have a kid who's really close, a little bit of prep could get them over that line, and then heck, $2,000 is $2,000. It's also a nice resume point to put on their college application and resumes that they were a national merit finalist or national merit scholarship winner. Other than that pretty limited set of cases, we generally don't recommend prepping for the PSAT. To your second question about, will SAT prep help for PSAT? Absolutely. They're very much the same type of test. The PSAT is just shorter and easier. So, I sometimes liken it to, I'm a runner, if you're preparing for a marathon and you're doing marathon training and you're going through a marathon training program and your marathon's in 4 months, and at the halfway point, you run a half marathon, did your marathon training help you? Heck yeah, you're probably going to be pretty good at that half marathon if you've been training for a marathon. There are certainly different strategies, marathon running versus half marathon running, and there's some specialized things, but all of the content in any PSAT prep course or book or, class is going to apply, on an SAT prep class is going to apply to the PSAT. The PSAT is just a bit easier and a bit shorter. Same kind of format, same kind of layout, same sorts of sections, just a little easier and a little shorter.
So we kind of got, I don't mean stuck, but we answered a lot of questions, but I don't know if you have like a few more things that you want to mention.
Yeah, I think there are just two more slides, and then I'm happy to take more questions. One thing that's important on the timing is there is a disadvantage to waiting too long to decide. And when I showed these slides to my staff, they actually asked me to put this in for you guys, because the key thing about whether it's test prep with us, on your own, in a class, is it takes time. And so the further you get through this process without having a test score that's a good supplement to your application, the more you're starting to close doors and close options. So doing the prep, particularly in the junior year, even the end of the sophomore year, is really an advantage, because that senior year is real busy, as I said, and the further away you get from Algebra 2, the harder it gets to recover that math content. So I think sometimes parents are comforted by the headlines of, oh, tests don't matter, this isn't important. It's one more thing off your plate as a busy and stressed out parent. Totally relate to that. And they say, oh, forget it, I'm not going to worry about it. They get into the summer or fall of senior year, their students narrowing the list, and they realize, oh no, I actually really need a test score, because either it's required or there's merit aid involved or whatever of those things. And now they don't have one, and now you're trying to cram it in fall of senior year. That can be really challenging. It can be hard. That's probably the toughest semester of high school in many ways, in terms of demands on kids' time. So the more you can figure out your strategy early, pace out the test prep so that it's not all left to the last minute, the better off your student will be. And it really just gives you options. Again, trying to decide now in February of the junior year, let alone February of the sophomore year, what your kid's going to want a year plus down the line can be really hard. We get a lot of questions from parents about the UC system, the University of California system, which is fully test blind and will not look at test scores at all currently. What's interesting about that is parents call us and say, oh, it's okay, my kid's in California, we don't need a test score. Not actually true. It's only true if you're only going to apply. If you know a year and a half in advance.
If you're going to apply to those schools and then be able to get in.
Only going to apply to the UC system, then sure, don't bother. But it's pretty rare that we talk to a student who knows a year and a half that the only school they're applying to are those that are test blind. Most often they just don't know yet, or that list is 20 colleges long and still getting whittled down. Maybe their top choice is a UC school, but if you don't get in and you have no backup plan, that can be really tough. So looking to the test score as a way to open doors and give options is an important perspective.
Yeah, Katie, I just wanted to emphasize that, because it's kind of funny. The first question we got back at about 8:30, which I held, was somebody asking, my child is a junior. How will we know if test optional will be something that will be continuing for the admissions class of 2023? And we don't know. We don't know. And so we're trying, right. I mean, my guess is a good majority will continue to be test optional, but we don't know who might flip and decide, we tried it, but now that things are back to normal, we're going to, go to requiring tests again. And if you can take away one thing from the whole presentation, and this doesn't even just relate to testing, it kind of relates to this whole process, is you want to have as many options as possible. And the more that the process goes along, deadlines happen, or you just can't roll back, and you do lose options. And that's kind of, what we try and stress, whether it's from a financial perspective, whether it's from, an admissibility perspective, you just want to be able to start as early as possible. Time is your friend, and then plan things out, and then that just gives you options. And maybe one option is your child isn't going to submit the test score, but at least they had it, and you had that option to decide it.
Yeah,
so
the door's open. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
that's our philosophy too, especially this early. Definitely. Super briefly, let me just tell you a little bit about what we do. And this is not at all meant to be a sales pitch, but just to give a sense of what our company does. So we are a test prep and tutoring company. We offer ACT, SAT, PSAT, also the high school admissions exams, all AP exams, and academic subjects. So we are happy to help if it plays a role in your family, and we can be of assistance. We do only one-on-one tutoring. We don't do group or classroom. basically because one-on-one works better and is often a better use of your student's time. We customize everything specifically to your student through a pretty sophisticated assessment and curriculum mapping system to try to really, our recognition is that we know that parents and kids are so busy these days. And so if we can get it done in fewer hours by targeting weak spots, that's how we want to approach it. We do offer free virtual practice tests, and this will be in the follow-up emails as well. Again, getting that baseline is really important. It's going to give you a much clearer picture as to where your kid is and what your options are and what the possibilities are. So we offer free virtual practice tests. There's no obligation to them. They are real SAT and ACTs. We don't write them ourselves. We use retired exams. They're proctored over the internet by our staff, so they're timed appropriately. Still not exactly the same as sitting in a gym with 100 kids fidgeting and moving their pencils and wiggling, but it's closer, it's meant to be strictly timed and set and structured so that it's as real as possible and you get a score as well as an analysis. And we are running a discount for folks who attend the webinar, which is $200 off any 18-hour or more package through the end of the month. And again, Debbie's staff will provide details on that. So that's who we are.
There's a good question here, Katie. Somebody asking, is test prep something that focuses more on the test taking techniques, or is it on the concepts of what a student should know going into the test?
Short answer is all of the above. So our test prep programs and any test prep programs focus on three things: content review, particularly in math, but in any area, making sure your student has the underlying skills to be able to perform well. So are there pieces of algebra 2 they've forgotten, or geometry, or grammar rules, reading rules, that kind of stuff, vocabulary. So content is one piece. Strategy is the second piece. And we focus on both general test taking strategies, which again, college admissions aside, taking tests is a part of life. So helping that kids build the life skill of how to take a test, how to approach a test, when should you skip, when should you guess. We talk about building a kid's toolbox of strategies so that when they see a question, they have a range of options to pull out to attack that particular question and a toolbox of those strategies. And then the third piece is timing and familiarity. There's a lot of anxiety around these tests. Kids can really psych themselves out and get nervous and get thrown off. The timing and pacing is key. So in our program, and again, most test prep programs, there's a practice test component through the structure of the program to give them kind of game day like practice. Again, back to the marathon training, right? You got to run those long runs and sort of practice putting it all together. Endurance is a big piece of these tests. How often do kids or any of us sit down for 3.5 hours and focus on something the whole time with pretty minimal breaks? So part of the process that we take kids through is building up that endurance. So those are the three things: content, strategy, and kind of pacing, endurance, and familiarity.
Can you just talk a little bit? This is we've gotten a few questions about this. If your student has a 504 and might be getting extra time, how does that relate? Do you do the test prep differently for a student like that?
Great question. So a couple of thoughts. First of all, you have to make sure you've applied for accommodations to the College Board or ACT. They're not automatically granted. There's lots of information out there on the internet about how that all works. But so if we have a student working with us, we want to know what are your official accommodations. And then we do all of our practice under the conditions your student will have. So if they have time and a half, we're going to have all of their practice tests timed the same way. Because again, we want them to have as much game day like practice as we can. So one key thing is early in at least the junior year, if not the sophomore year, making sure you're talking with the guidance counselor, the special ed team, if it's relevant, the 504 coordinator, to make sure that you're going to the testing companies with a fully documented situation so that you get those accommodations approved. Some parents, I think, leave it to the last minute or assume it's going to be fine. And the testing companies don't always go along with what schools recommend, unfortunately. So getting all that paperwork aligned and ready to go early is important so that as you're going through whatever prep process you're taking your kid through, you know what their actual test day will be like. Is it over multiple days? All that kind of stuff.
And as a parent, one of my kids did have an IEP. And so we had to go through that process. And let me just tell you, you should start a good 3 or 4 months before you're even, your students even thinking of taking the test, and one test organization approved it and one did not, and the back and forth and that type of stuff. So yes, it's just, takes time. So one last question, and it's a fair question. Somebody's asking if you can talk a little bit about the cost of test prep, and maybe just explain, the reason why you encourage people to call, because and so how you'll explain how you can help people's situation, and how there isn't like one straight answer about what it's going to cost.
I feel like everything I've answered, I've said, I wish I had an easy answer, but I don't. Same with this one. I wish I had an easy answer. And in terms of stepping outside of us for a moment, test prep in the world, there's a huge range, from free classes at school that are classroom-based classes, all the way up to $10,000 or $20,000 private tutors that cost $500 an hour, and everything in between. So, and each thing fits a different need, right? There's advantages to doing it in a group. There's advantages to doing it in a smaller group. You can self-prep. There are books you can buy. There's Khan Academy resources. So if you have a student who's very self-motivated, doing prep on their own can be great. It can be a great way to review and brush up. So in the world, there's a huge range. In our specific range of services, we have a wide variety of packages and a wide variety of prices, really depending on what you need. Our whole philosophy is customize it to the specific student. So our test prep in general, to give you a ballpark, can range from $1,000 to $5,000 or $6,000, and everything across that range, really depending on where is your student starting, how much time do you have, how far are you trying to get in terms of a score increase, and what does your student need? So we have a wide range of choices. We tend to fall sort of in the middle of the world of test prep. There are companies that are way more expensive than we are. Group classes and small group classes are going to be less expensive. We're sort of in that middle range.
Okay, one last, I think, easy question, so we'll just finish with this. We didn't really mention about the essay part of the tests.
Yeah, so there is no essay portion anymore on the SAT, which is kind of nice. Again, unless it's done on a school day, in which case some states still have the essay. The ACT does have an essay. A lot of colleges don't use it and don't look at it. And even some of the schools that are test required say they don't require the essay. So it's yet another thing to add to the list of you need to research the specific colleges. If a college is requiring the essay, it's basically a prompt, and they have, I think it's 25 minutes. I can't remember for ACT. I think it's either 20 or 25 minutes to write an essay. The reason why colleges like it, those that like it, the ones that like it, the reason why they like it is because it's an unfiltered writing sample, right? So the college essay part, or the short answer essays, students can work on, they can edit, they can get help with. The colleges don't know for sure how much assistance a student might have gotten on that essay. If you put a kid in a room with a piece of paper and a pencil and say, write an essay for 25 minutes about pick your favorite topic, you're getting an unfiltered writing sample from that student. So that's why some colleges like it. Many colleges have kind of gotten away from it, and most don't require it.
Okay, well,
and you can choose one more thing on essay. Sorry, when you register for the ACT, you can choose ACT with essay or ACT without essay. So when you register, you pick, is your kid going to do the essay or not? If they don't, they just walk out and are done. If they do, they stay for that last section.
Well, thank everyone who stayed. We definitely went for like an hour and 50 minutes. An hour and 20 minutes. So I appreciate you guys staying this long to hear all this information. Katy, thank you so much. Somebody said, this was a great presentation, very informative. I completely agree. So thank you for all of your effort putting together and bringing the numbers and the explanation. It was great. And so I hope that people learned tonight, which I think you did. And, this is really all to provide information for your family. There is no right or wrong. You kind of just have to, take it in, know your own student, know what they're interested in, what type of schools they're applying for, what their bandwidth is, what their, motivation is, and, and make an individual decision. You are free, and in an email we'll follow up. You are free to call StudyPoint, fill out a form if you just want to talk and figure out what is the right thing for your student. I mean, that's, perfectly valid way to approach this. So Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Katie. And I'm sure we'll see Katie, probably see you again at some point, and we'll see everybody else again at some point.
Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Okay, good night.